actually happens. Well, it says we're live, but whether that's actually true or not on my channel, I can never work out, and it's not telling me. So hopefully some lovely commenters will suddenly say that we are live, which would be very nice of them if they're here. But this is the bit that I think, have you found this, Maggie, doing live events? It's that first like 5 minutes when people are joining, where it's all a bit nerve-wracking. And we're live. There we go. We've got people joining us. So, hi everyone, I'm Simon, and tonight is a very special video because me and my mother Louise have been joined by Maggie O'Farrell, who lots of you will know I have adored for years, and whose Hamnet, I have the hardback here, but it is out in paperback, was me and my mum's pick to win the Women's Prize, which it did. But also, I think I can say safely, was one of our favourite books of last year. It was my favourite book of last year. I think it was yours, Mum, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank
you for joining us, Maggie.
It's my pleasure. And actually, it would be really nice if every Monday I could log on to chat to you both and you could just say that thing again, and that would just set me up for the week. That would really encourage me, you know, in my writing for the week. So if that's okay, that would be fine with me.
I'm sure. Well,
I have heard that you've been writing in a doll's house. Is that right? Or a...
A doll's house would be brilliant. It was a Wendy house. Yeah. It's a Wendy house. Slight but very crucial difference. I haven't shrunk myself down to a borrower. No, I did. Well, actually, it doesn't happen very often, but there were a couple of times. It was just at the end of the kind of homeschooling year last summer. And my husband and I were sort of splitting the homeschooling, trying to get a bit of work done in between times. But there was just one morning when just every 2 minutes somebody was coming into my, and it was Will's turn to look after the kids, but every 2 minutes someone was coming in. They needed a jam jar. They'd lost their pencil case. They couldn't find their French book. And I was so desperate for some just uninterrupted concentration time that I went to my youngest daughter's Wendy house in the garden, and I just kind of squeezed myself in and pulled the door shut and just sat with my laptop on my knee. And it was so blissful. Nobody found me for about 2 hours, and all the pencil cases remained lost, and nobody had the jam jar. But it meant and the only person who found me was the cat, and he didn't really bother me at all. He just came in and just hung out with me. So it was actually, but actually I have to say now, I have, because we used to have this really horrible shed in the garden that blew down in a gale, and I've now, I was actually going to say I've rebuilt it into a studio. I should say I've had someone to build it for me, because that would not be very true. So now I've got basically my own Wendy house, but adult sized, which is good because it's not very good for the posture, crushing yourself into a child's Wendy house.
A doll's house would have been worse, to be fair. So yes.
I mean, that would have involved some kind of amazing shrinking potion. I quite like the idea of it. And actually, we've got this really chic sort of 60s Danish doll's house, so that would be actually a great place. I would quite like to be inside my doll's house.
Well, it's a future goal then. Let's say that the next writing studio can be a life-size doll's house. That's what we'll go about. Anyway, we're here to talk about Hamnet, not doll's houses and Wendy houses. And I know, Mum, you had a question that you wanted to kick off with.
Well, I was really curious to know when you first met Hamnet, when you first sort of encountered him.
Well, I first heard about the name. I heard about his existence, the real Hamnet Shakespeare, when I was at school, and I was studying the play Hamlet for my Scottish Highers. So I was 16, rising 17, and I had this really fantastic English teacher. I was really, really lucky. One of those English teachers who really opens your eyes and teaches you everything you need to know about literature and what it can do. And you know, when I went on to university, I never found anyone actually as good as him. So he told us in passing one day that William Shakespeare had a son who was called Hamnet, and he died at the age of 11. And then William had gone on 4 or 5 years later to write the play Hamnet. And just instantly, I was really struck by, you know, the obvious similarity of the names. And it was only later really that I realised that Elizabethan spelling is so unstable that they are actually the same name. But just what it meant. I remember even as, 16, when I was a really long way off from being a parent myself, thinking, well, this feels hugely significant. You know, what does it mean to call a play and a hero and a ghost, let's not forget, after your dead son? You know, what does this act tell us? And it's always just felt to me that, I think I've always been fascinated by that link, but it's always just felt to me that, Shakespeare is a really mysterious person. There's so little we know about him. We've got his enormous wealth of plays, but on the other hand, there's so many gaps in his story. But it just seems to me that in that really small act, or well, it's quite a large act really, but of using his dead son's name, he briefly becomes visible to us as a human being and as a grieving father and as a very sad man. Actually, he becomes human to us, not this kind of literary behemoth.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
With Hamnet, when was it that you knew that you wanted to write his story, or actually the story of Shakespeare and Agnes and Hamnet and the whole family?
Well, I had thought about it. I'd sort of circled around the idea of writing this as a novel for quite a long time. In fact, weirdly, only today I was looking back in a notebook where it's my ideas notebook, and I jot down really tiny little things, 1 or 2 lines of ideas I have, most of which are absolutely terrible. But I just came across something, and it was 2 lines, and it said novel about William Shakespeare's son Hamnet, and I'd forgotten it was there. It's funny, and that was written in 2013. So you see, that's how long I've been thinking about writing the book. But actually, the thing that really always made me delay, which maybe Louise can understand, is that I have a son and 2 daughters. And I always felt really superstitious about this idea when my own son wasn't past the age of Hamnet. So my son's actually now a 6 foot 17-year-old, and not that there was a huge risk of him contracting the Black Death, but I just knew that in order to write the book, I was going to have to put myself inside the skin of a woman who is forced to sit at the bedside of her child and watch him die, because that's what happened. Because obviously there's my fictional Hamlet, but there's also, let's never forget, the real Hamlet Shakespeare, whose bones are somewhere in the churchyard in Stratford-upon-Avon. And I just couldn't do it. And I thought about the idea, and I'd read a lot more about Shakespeare, and then I would just sort of shy away and think, I can't do that until my own son is past that milestone.
See, I just find it fascinating that you can do it at all. I find it, it's miraculous to me that because in the novel you go to places that are so punishing and so hard, and yet you do it in a way that, Simon and I unfortunately have experienced deep grief, as most people have, and the way you write about it to me seems so true. The essence of it is so true, and I don't know. I'm curious to know how you take yourself to those spaces. I think it's really brave.
Well, I think 2 things really. Sorry, it's not COVID cough. I think it's not. If you love somebody, it's not too huge a stretch of the imagination to imagine what your life would be like without them. I think that fear or that knowledge or awareness makes up a huge part of our attachment with other people, doesn't it? The idea that grief is the flip side of love. Our bond with somebody is made up of quite a lot of fear about what our life would be like if they were, God forbid, to be taken away from us. So it isn't cute. It's a bit like, I was thinking, just something I'm writing at the moment, I had to write something about embroidery, and I know literally nothing, probably less than nothing about embroidery. So I asked a friend of mine who's really good at it, and she showed me this amazing embroidery hoop that was beautiful, beautiful picture of a Tudor rose that she'd embroidered. And then she turned it over, and on the back was this kind of fascinating mess and tangle of all these threads and knots. And I was thinking, but that's what grief is, isn't it? You just flip it upside down. It's the harsh and difficult, knotty side of love, isn't it?
Is that why
the main engine behind me writing this book is that I've always felt that Hamnet, the real Hamnet, has been totally overlooked and ignored by history. He's been consigned to a literary footnote. And, I've read really respected biographers of Shakespeare say, it's impossible to say whether or not there's any significance in the fact that he used his son's name for the play. And I just think, what? What writer would lightly take the name of his quite recently dead child and write it again and again in a manuscript and listen to it again and again during rehearsals and speak it himself again and again on those early, during those early productions of the play? That's a hugely significant act and not something that you can just diminish and sort of write off. So I wanted his death to feel significant. I wanted his life to feel significant. I wanted people to know that this boy was really important. Without his really short and tragically cut short life, we wouldn't have Hamlet. We probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night.
And I love it. Oh, sorry, Sam. Go on.
I was just going to say, I wondered, because obviously you say that Shakespeare is still quite a mystery, and in the book he's never named, which I thought was really, really brilliant. And I wondered, one, why he did that, but also was it to kind of almost give Agnes her spot in the limelight as well, because she is one of the best characters I have ever read. I literally adore her. Like, yeah, she's phenomenal, and the book made me cry from the writing and the joy as much as it did the grief. But yeah, I just wondered if not naming Shakespeare, was that to give other people more of a chance?
It wasn't really, actually. I mean, I always felt that, I always knew that Shakespeare was going to be a slightly more marginal figure, partly because, I mean, just in terms of geography, we know that he was in London for most of Hamlet's life. I mean, I'm sure he came back and forth, but he was there, he was absent. He was working in London, which wasn't actually that unusual for the men in households in those days, in rural Warwickshire, to go to London, because that's where the jobs were. But I think, I mean, it was sort of multifaceted, really, why I did away with his name in a sense. I mean, partly because his name, probably more than any other in existence, has so much significance and so much weight. It carries huge heft, and everybody, all of us, have our own relationship with Shakespeare inside our head. We all have our own version of him, in a sense. He pervades our very language, and his plays continue to alter and change the way we think about ourselves and think about our relationships with others. And I found, actually, I just couldn't write a sentence in a novel like, William Shakespeare came down the stairs and ate his breakfast. You just think, oh my God, I feel like a total Egypt, And then you think, well, should I call him William? No, that doesn't seem right. Will? No, it's so presumptuous. So yeah, it just, and I thought, well, if I can't write it and stay submerged in the narrative, I can't expect my readers to stay submerged in the narrative as well. So I just thought I'm going to have to do away with it. But also, in a sense, the book, the novel, is really about names. It's about the significance of names, and Hamlet's name which is familiar and strange all at the same time. And it's about our connection with names, and how we can get separated from them, and names go off and have a kind of life of their own. And also, it's significant for me that, the woman we know is Anne Hathaway. I mean, we're always taught to call her Anne Hathaway, but actually her name was Shakespeare for most of her life. And also, when I read, one of the things I read when I was researching the book is her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, was quite a successful sheep farmer, and he died a year before she and William got married. And in his will, he leaves her a very generous dowry, but he names her as my daughter Agnes. Which for me was an absolute kind of lightning bolt moment, because I thought, on top of everything else about her, which we've been taught, have we been calling her by the wrong name for 400 years? So I wanted to, I suppose, in a sense, I wanted to give this name back to her, which obviously, if anyone knows her real name, it's going to be her dad, you'd assume. So I wanted to give it back to her to sort of show readers that I wanted to ask readers to forget everything they think they know about William Shakespeare and about Anne Hathaway, and open themselves up to a new interpretation, to see Shakespeare as the man, the human being, the teacher or the brother or the husband or the Latin tutor or whatever, appellation I was giving him on whichever page, and just to say that these are people you haven't yet met. These are new interpretations, these are new possibilities for them.
And I think it'll make people reinterpret Hamlet as well in the process. I mean, I would read it differently now.
Yeah, well, I think if you read the play Hamlet, through the lens of this lost son, it's, to me anyway, it's always felt so deep and deeply obvious to me that the play is a message from a father in one realm to a son who's in another. It's so underpinned by this deep sort of undertow of grief, and it's quite easy. When I went back to read the play, I'd sort of half forgotten that the ghost is called Hamlet as well. So there are these weird sort of echoes, and the idea that Hamnet's identity has been split into a father and a son, but he's changed it round. So the son is the one who's grieving, the son is the one who's desperate to see the apparition and the ghost of his father. And I think the thing I find almost unreadable in the play now is the ghost talking about his death and describing this. I mean, they are the lines most agonizing, the physical agony which Shakespeare writes. The ghost talking about, horrible, horrible, most horrible, and the poison coursing through his body. And I mean, if we're thinking about it now, actually, the hairs on the back of my neck are rising, because I think, and I dread, actually, I hope it isn't an actual description of little Hamlet's death, but I suspect it might be.
Gosh, I just wanted to quickly mention, we've had some comments. So Skin Finesse said, Hamnet, and I love this, Hamnet is like diving into a well of emotion, and I'm holding every chapter close while grieving for my own. I think that's beautiful. And Janie Edwards said that she felt that not using his name and using the alternative names or real names for both Agnes and Hamnet was a stroke of genius. See, all the compliments for you, Maggie. They're all out. This can be a weekly thing. One thing I wanted to ask you about was, obviously nobody could have predicted last year. And how did that affect the book for you? Because obviously you'd written about a plague, a pandemic, and there is that amazing chapter. One of the things that we most commonly got when I asked that on Instagram for people for questions, they wanted to know how you went about writing how the plague moves, but then also how you felt about that once we were in a pandemic.
I mean, it is strange. Obviously, you know, nobody saw last year / this year coming, and actually all I remember, you know, this time last year, so Hamnet came out the first week of lockdown last year in March, and at the time it was all just a kind of you know, I mean, you know, remember how strange the month of March was last year, that, you know, we gradually had this odd realization, this sort of cloud was gathering over us, and we were looking at the maps, and it reached Italy, and then we were thinking, well, are the schools going to close? Are they going to close for a week? Are they going to close for 2 weeks? You know, it seems so odd looking back on it now. You know, we had no idea what was ahead of us. And in a sense, my March was a bit odd because I got a phone call from my editor saying, you know, we're going to have to cancel the book tour. You know, we're going to have to cancel the book launch. And then she phoned and said, actually, all the bookshops are shutting. So, and that was the real kind of, oh God, you know, what's going to happen? And everything was so peculiar. And it was only sort of later on when I started doing, you know, because obviously all events, suddenly all the sort of physical book tour was cancelled. I did all this sort of online stuff, and people were saying, but what about that chapter? And I thought, oh God, yeah. I'd slightly forgotten about it at the time. But it's funny, that chapter it's not something I really planned for the novel. I mean, I always thought in my mind, you know, I mean, I should say that it's not known what the real Hamnet Shakespeare died of. So his burial is recorded, but there's no cause of death. But he did die in a plague year, and he died in high summer. And I mean, there are lots of reasons why I chose the Black Death, and Shakespeare never talks about the Black Death in any of his plays, which I find extraordinary, really, when you're given how prevalent it was, and it would have been at the forefront of every single Elizabethan's mind. It was an ever-present threat. I mean, Shakespeare's career would have been constantly interrupted by the outbreaks of the plague in London, because the very first thing civic authorities would do is to shut all the playhouses. You know, if you consider the original Globe Theatre had a capacity for 3,000 people, and they were all gathering in the middle of the day in a hot sun. You know, you can see why. I mean, you know, we know now how the Black Death was spread, but they had no idea. They had no idea that it was spread by fleas and lice. So it was just a kind of strange confluence. And also, when I was looking at the life of Judith, Hamlet's twin, she lives a really long time. She lives into her 70s, which is astonishing at a time when the life expectancy was 48, and she has 3 sons, all of whom die. So one dies as an infant, and then her 2 sons die aged 20 and 21 within a week of each other, again in a plague year and again during summer. And I just got the idea of maybe she had some kind of immunity because her husband dies as well in the same outbreak of plague. So I don't know, the whole thing, it all just added up, and I felt it was. But I think that chapter, I wanted to kind of give the novel and read as well the sort of sense of the global, enormous, horrific scale of that pandemic that Elizabethans had to grapple with, because, you know, their statistics are so horrifying. In one particular outbreak, 1/4 of the world's population was killed, and that's only Europe and Asia. And it could kill a healthy person in 24 hours. So there were accounts that I read of people sitting down to dinner one night, completely healthy, and then being dead the next day. And these are healthy people in their 20s. You know, it was so virulent and so horrific, and it just cut enormous swathes through towns and communities. And, you know, it was very, very extreme. So in a sense, I think it's odd, I think, because normally when you finish a book and you put the last full stop and you finish the final copy edit, your relationship with it in a sense is set and it's finished. You know, you're out of the book carries on without you. But with Hamnet, I think my relationship with it has changed actually since in the course of 2020 and 2021. And I think about it differently, because when I wrote that chapter, I had I had no idea what it was like, obviously, to live through a pandemic. And I remember sitting at this desk I'm sitting at now, thinking, well, I wonder what it's like, to be sitting in your house knowing there's this fatal disease coming towards you. And, it was just an act of research. I just did lots of research about Elizabethan trade routes, and I looked into the life cycle of the flea, which is horrific. If you ever feel like horrifying yourself, just look into that. It's really nasty reading. And, I had all these maps up on my wall of all places ships, dropped off certain cargo and took on another, and you can see why, this huge outburst of commerce, why all these diseases spread. It's the same reason that, our pandemic has spread. So, it was just that. But, when I saw all the infographics we were looking at in March, they looked exactly the same. These huge arrows coming from Asia over Europe and towards us here. And it is a strange thing. But I think, in a sense, the main, I suppose I feel, in a sense, I think we will, I think any sort of suffering that, we've been through collectively or individually, it does make you more sympathetic. It expands your capacity for empathy. And I think that will be true of us as a population. I think, in a sense, we're closer to the Elizabethans and previous populations than we were before. We can empathize a bit more. And I think also we can realize how lucky we are, in a way, because we know how our pandemic spreads, and we do have ventilators, and we have hospitals, and, we can wash our hands. We can, obviously we have been very unlucky, but in a sense, compared to them, we are luckier than them.
Yeah. Definitely. It's nice to hear that optimism as well. I think, I fully agree. I think that there are lots of things that we'll have much more gratitude for now. Can I ask a question about the sort of the pace of Hamnet, the novel? Because one of the things that it's really hard for me to pinpoint, but there's something about the pace of it that feels like I'm reading it in real time. And I just look, there's nothing rushed, there's nothing hurried, there's nothing, and yet it's unputdownable. And I get this feeling as I'm reading, not just this one actually, but other novels of yours that I've read, that I'm kind of drifting in and out of different people's consciousnesses. And I'm just wondering how you go about that. How do you achieve that sense of real time?
Well, I think I am both very interested and also quite resistant to chronology. So it is something I think about quite a lot when I'm thinking about a novel. You think about the different time frames, and in a sense, the first decision you have to make as a writer, if you think about your story as in a long line from A to B, that's the kind of real time of your narrative. Your first decision that you have to make, in a way, is at what point along that line do you jump in? You jump in near the end and then come right back to the beginning, as sort of a lot of Victorian framing narratives will do, or do you start in the middle, or do you start right at the beginning and work through it? So I suppose I always try and think about my novels before I start. I mean, I don't always plan. I don't always stick to the original plan at all. I quite like it when novels diverge from your original plan, but I think I like to think of a novel as a sort of 3D shape. So I've tried to think how it will look on the page visually, and also how it will feel as a kind of as the plot and the structure of it. But actually, I think Hamnet, in a sense, is one of the most straightforward, chronological books I've ever written. There are other books I've written which are much more. The chronology is much more complicated, and I kind of don't love chronology as a sort of narrative form. I find it quite a tyranny. I don't think that's the way our minds work. Very neatly, year after year, month after month, week after week. I think we're a lot more complicated, and our minds are much more braided in a way than that. So, but I think, I did have an earlier draft that I'd begun of Hamnet, and actually I would write a bit of it, and then actually I swerved away, and I've written 3 books instead of writing Hamnet. And when I went back to that, I read that document. It was probably about 15,000 words, and I realized I'd started it completely the wrong place. And I'd started it after Hamnet had died, and it was kind of his life was told in flashback, and it was really wrong. So I thought, well, the whole point of me wanting to write this is to bring Hamnet to life and say this boy was important. So I thought I had to start with him. And as soon as I just wrote the scene, which is still at the beginning of the novel, of him walking down a flight of stairs and looking for help for his twin sister. And as soon as I did that, it was like a key turning in the lock. That was what I needed to do. And I knew that the chronology of the book would be the last sort of week or 10 days or so of Hamnet's life. And then his death would come sort of about 2/3 of the way through. And then the rest would be devoted to the grief that his family feel. And of course, the play. I knew it would always end with the play because that was always a crucial magical link for me. So I don't know. I think it's one of those things, you know, I don't always know where the chronology will be, but I think it's a bit like driving along a country road at night in the dark. You don't know where the curves and the bumps are until you're actually on the road. You've got to be in the car, in the dark, in the road in order to find your way. You know, looking at a map is pointless. You know, you've got to be in the landscape. And I think it's the same thing with a novel. You don't know your way until you're there. You don't know the next corner or the next turning until you're actually doing it.
You've got to kind of react to the swerves and the bends, I guess, as it goes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. You never know what the landscape's going to throw up at you. That's a horrible image. Throw at you. Sorry. It's an unfortunate kind of phrase.
We've got a couple of questions from people who are watching along. So Amanda would like to know if you would be ever interested in writing about our current pandemic at some point, or have you had your fill of
my fill of illness? I don't know. In a sense, I think it's a bit early, really, isn't it, to make any decisions about that? And I don't mean because we're still in it. I think I think our responses to it and the way history is going to play out is probably going to take 10 or 15 years, isn't it? You know, I mean, the story's so far from over. I know that vaccinations are up and infection rates are down, which is all wonderful. But in a sense, the way we're all going to metabolize this crisis is going to take a while to play out. So I would think it would be too early, in a sense, to think about it. But I think it's absolutely inevitable that it's going to happen, you know, in very different ways. Artists and writers and sculptors and filmmakers are all, you know, we're all going to respond to it in a way, aren't we? But for me, anyways, I think we're still in the eye of the hurricane, aren't we?
I don't think collectively the public has processed it. Like I was saying, I've said this to quite a few people, when I had my first vaccination, it was actually sat after having it for the 15 minutes that I was waiting with all these other people, sort of everybody smizing as much as they could behind their masks and everyone saying thank you, that it really hit me that it was real. I think I still haven't quite processed that. So yeah, I think it'll definitely happen. I don't know if I'm going to want to read any of them because I've lived it. But
I think it will take a while for it to be metabolized. Yeah.
Lovely Kate Mayfield has asked, what was the most surprising moment of the writing process that happened while you were working on Hamnet?
Trying to remember, actually. There were certainly lots of surprising things I found out about the 16th century, which I didn't know. And in fact, my children limited me to 1 Tudor fact per day while I was writing it. I wasn't allowed more than one. At the dinner table, I would say, "Oh, you never guess what I found out today," and they got, not understandably, they got it for that. So I was only allowed one. But my favourite Tudor fact is that Tudor sheep are half the size of the sheep we have today. But wouldn't you just love one of those little Tudor sheep? I really would. Tiny little sheep.
That was amazing. And how did you find that out? Because people are asking about research, actually. And did you go to Stratford because Stratford's like a place of ghosts? Probably mini sheep ghosts.
Tiny little sheep. I mean, I did. You know, obviously there's a lot of library-based research because there's no shortage of books about Shakespeare. You could spend the rest of your life reading about him if you want to, and lots of people do. But in terms of writing, particularly the lives of the women and the sort of domestic side of the novel, I mean, because those lives are so undocumented, I actually spent quite a lot of time trying to find out as much as I could about the lives of the women, and it was very vague. And so what I did was I actually took the tiny little scraps of information I could find, and I went off and physically did those things. So I found a Tudor recipe for bread making, and I made that because I wanted to have a shot at doing it. And I learnt to fly a kestrel. So Agnes, of course, has a kestrel, and that's the first time that he sees her through a window. And I went to the borders and learnt to fly one. That was actually the most fun thing I've ever done in the name of research. And I also, because there's a lot in the book about plant lore and herbology, and which actually comes from Hamlet. There's a famous scene where Ophelia hands people plants, and every single plant she hands them is a well-known Elizabethan cure for some flaw in their character that she perceives. So it fascinated me that Shakespeare clearly knew what he was talking about in that scene. You know, he's writing from a point of deep knowledge. And I just thought it would be nice to give that expertise to her, to his wife, to kind of sort of underpin the idea that their marriage was a partnership and an exchange. They had this exchange of knowledge and artistry. So in order to kind of understand that, I planted my own Elizabethan medicinal garden. So I got books, a sort of contemporary book of the time, 16th century book, and told you how you should plant it. And I mean, actually, the diagrams were very beautiful, and my garden wasn't that beautiful. But, you know, gardens aren't always meant to be beautiful. This is a medicinal garden. So I went on a course finding out how you would turn them into medicines. And the other really fun thing I did was I went mudlarking along the Thames a couple of times. I went digging in Tudor dumps, and I found Tudor coins, and I found the brass pins that they used to stiffen their ruffs, and I found a ship's glass, which is triangular prism. In fact, it wasn't here, but it's not. Otherwise, I would show you, which was used to refract light into the hold of the ship, which felt so amazing to find that, because, of course, you know, there is a very important ship in Hamnet that comes all the way from Alexandria and brings the plague. So I felt it was like a weird moment when I just dug this thing out of the water, and the guy I was with, who was the proper mudlarker, not like me, he said, "It's a ship's glass," and I thought, God, I almost thought it's come from my ship, and then I thought, no, actually, my ship was made up. So I have that on the shelf of my studio.
That's lovely.
Somebody called Nell who wants to know, Maggie, whether you're working on a new project at the moment.
I am. Yes, I'm about 3/4 of the way through a new novel, and I have to say I'm superstitious about two things: writing about the death of a son, which was older than my own son, and I'm also superstitious talking about anything I haven't finished yet, so I can't really tell you anything, I'm afraid, other than that I'm 3/4 of the way through it. I was worried if I talk about it, it's going to sort of drain me of the urge to write it. So
fair enough.
I have to keep it under my hat, I'm afraid.
I was wondering, in I Am, you talk about when you were a young girl and you were very ill, and you had overheard, was it a nurse possibly saying that you could die? But I think you thought they were talking about somebody else. And I wondered how that fed into Hamnet, but also where snow angels go, and if that's something that's kind of been bubbling under with your work. But I feel like, having read a lot of your books, it's particularly prevalent recently.
Yes, possibly. I mean, it's funny, you know, I think in a way all books are reactions to their predecessor. All the books that you write are reactions to their predecessor, the one that you wrote previously.
Just going to hold them up. They're all here, everyone. Make sure you see them.
Also, can I just say, Simon, off the cuff, I really like the way your jumper is exactly the same blue.
I call it Hamnet blue.
I bought it. Oh, thanks. It's beautiful.
When I was doing
the back of Elizabeth portraits, and we were kind of, that's the blue that we need. Very beautiful.
No, when I did the first episode of Sky and I talked about Hamnet on that show, I'd purposefully worn a Hamnet blue just for that. Dedication that nobody knew was going on behind the scenes, Maggie. That's what I'm going to
say. Simon, I like it.
Sorry. One's in Tudor Rose Red though, so she's doing very well. We've done it.
I love it. It's great. I'm really laying the slide down.
No, we were talking about your child and how and what you experienced and how that went into Hamnet or other work.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, you know, because obviously I wrote my memoir before writing Hamnet, and I don't know whether perhaps I needed to write that first. I don't know. Perhaps I needed to face up to that experience of my childhood. I mean, obviously, it's not as if I've ever shied away from it. Thank you. And and you know, it's not something that I forgot. But it's only when I was writing the book that I started really researching what had happened to me, because obviously it was all, you know, it happened 40 years ago when I was 8 or 9. And actually, I got all my hospital notes, and reading those was astonishing, because it was this kind of typed, you know, because it was from the 1981, and they were all typed up on this kind of microfiche, and that was really strange, reading about yourself in the third person, about the patient and this and what happened, and you know, and the way it fitted my recollection, and also didn't fit it, because things that I thought happened quite close together were obviously weeks apart. So that was quite and obviously facing up to that was an interesting experience. But I think it is something that you do really maybe when you reach, and I was going to say middle age, but I think I sort of wish that we could rebrand middle age, because it's always seen as this very negative thing. But to me, I think if you are middle age, I mean, if I am in my middle age, I really hope I am, because I feel like I really hope I've got another half to go. You know, I think if we are middle aged, when we're middle aged, we're really damn lucky. You know, if we're only halfway through, I hope I am. But I think there is a kind of tipping point. You know, it's like a seesaw tipping from one side to the other. I remember walking along a seesaw when I was a child and feeling that moment where it tips is quite exciting. And I think when you do hit your mid-40s, in a sense, something does happen psychologically to you, and you feel that tip, which is not a bad thing. It's an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's just something I noticed particularly. I mean, you've always written about family, which I also think the thing that I want to say is Hamnet is a family drama. It is, and that's one thing I love about it. Yes, there are famous, infamous people involved, but at the heart, it is about love and family and grief and all of those things, which I think you've always written about, which I think is fantastic. I think this book to me is almost like a condensation of the books of yours I've read, and it's like, I don't know, how can I put it? Pure feral catnip. I'm doing really well with my analogies today.
I think they need to put that on the cover of the book. I think, Simon, we need to put that on the cover of the book.
On that note, Mum, have you a penultimate question?
I don't know whether I can follow that one.
Where do we go from catnip?
I was going to ask you actually, because one of the moments, the many moments I loved in Hamnet, but one of them that really sort of drew a wry smile to my face was the sort of Warwickshire yokels, if I dare call them that, response to Shakespeare's Money. And this whole idea, you know, how can you make money out of this playwriting thing? And I was quite intrigued by that. Because I wondered whether, I don't know, is it, have you always had that urge to write, and is it a pleasure? And I don't know, do you sort of still feel it's quite strange to be making a living out of that? I don't know. It just struck me as really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. No, but actually, I think I was very intrigued through when I was writing the book about how he would have been seen in Warwickshire. I think that fascinated me as I was writing it, because, you know, he must have been extraordinary even as a teenager. You know, he must have stuck out like a sore thumb. You know, you think this is a rural market town, a rural farming community. I mean, what must they have thought of him? You know, I don't think they would have thought of him as this kind of genius. They would have thought he was just probably very odd. I mean, you imagine being his Latin teacher at school or his rhetoric teacher at school. I mean, he must have been, you know, we know now, of course, you know, how extraordinary his imagination and his, you know, how much he knew and how much he could turn into metaphor, how much he could alchemize experience into art. But then he must have been, I mean, you know, he must have been like nobody else had ever come across, you know. And I think also later in life, you know, at the end of his career in London, he was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He was an incredibly good businessman and very good at making money and not saving it. You know, I mean, at the end of his career, he lived in really modest lodgings in London. He lived in one room in London, and we know that for a fact. It's not something I invented. And but all his money he sent back to Stratford. So he bought a massive house for his wife and daughters a year after Hamnet died, and he bought cottages and he fields. So he was, I have a suspicion in Stratford he was known more as a landlord than he was as an actor or a player or a playwright, which really fascinates me. But obviously, you never really know. But in terms of me, you know, I still can't quite believe that I'm able to do the thing I love and get paid for it. It seems extraordinary, and certainly not that way. I was certainly not brought up. Yeah, but I think there's an important distinction to be made that, you know, you've always wanted to write or you wanted to be a writer. And when I was a kid, I you know, obviously I didn't know anyone who was a writer. You know, I grew up in a really small Scottish seaside town, and it was not full of writers. And so I think in a sense, I kind of thought writers were these sort of mysterious beings, a bit like Greek gods, and they were probably dead. You know, I didn't think they were dead. But the idea that writers were alive was extraordinary. But I knew I wanted to write, but I never even dared to think that I might be able to be a writer. I think that's two different things. But I've never really had the urge. I don't remember not having the urge to put things down on paper, even when I was really young.
I'm very glad you did.
A final question from me, and I meant to say at the beginning before we start recording, Maggie, once we end, if you stay on with me and Mum, and then we'll end it. That sounds, I should have said that at the beginning, sorry, I forgot. Yes, the after chat, the after party. A final question for me is, me and Mum absolutely adore the Women's Prize. It's one of our favourite prizes and has been for years. How was it for you winning the Women's Prize last year, which we both predicted, not that we're smug about it, but we were pretty like 100% sure.
Well, I was not. It never even occurred to me that I would win. I mean, genuinely, I was so shocked when they told me. I thought they were joking. And of course, they told me over, like this, over a Zoom call. So the setup does feed into that kind of imposter syndrome. But it wasn't, I mean, the funny thing was that actually being on, like you said, I mean, I love the Women's Prize. It's always, it always dictates my reading for several months after, the long list and the short list. I love it. I love looking to see what's going to be on those lists. But being on the short list felt like a win in itself, and that felt like more than enough. The idea that I was one of the 6 books on the shortlist was so thrilling. And to be honest, the shortlist was so brilliant, I think. It was a really, really strong one with such fantastic and different books. They were all so different. So it honestly never occurred to me that I would win. And actually, I didn't even think about it. I just felt thrilled to be on the shortlist. So I was very shocked. And actually what happened was I'd done an online event with Natalie Haynes. That was great, and then we'd gone really well, and I logged off, and then I had to go, and the cat had been sick on the kitchen floor. Sorry, everyone. And so I was mopping that up, and then I got this text message saying, "Can you just jump back onto Zoom because we need to take a photo?" And I just thought, I don't really want to. I'm done for the night now. So I thought, I'll just ignore it. And then they said again, saying, "No, can you really please come back onto the Zoom call?" And I thought, fine, I'll do it then. Slightly crossly, well, here I am. And anyway, and that's when they told me I'd won. And honestly, I was so shocked. But in a sense, actually, I think I was quite lucky in a way, the setup, because if I had been told at the party, I'd have been so shocked that I would not have been able to give a speech because I have nothing to say. But in that way around, I did have 2 days in order to get my speech ready. So it all worked out well in the end.
It did. It's brilliant. And also, before we go, I just want to say thank you as well from me, because this is the first live me and Mum have done with an author, and we were thrilled it was you. We were both very, very excited. Yeah. Also, you were the first author that said yes to doing my solo podcast, the first author to do a very rogue video with me back in the early days of BookTube. And I just want to thank you for that and for all the books that you've given us, because honestly, it's a joy and it's brilliant. So a huge thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you for both of you. I'm honoured to be your first author.
it's no, honestly, seriously, we were both a bit nervous beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah.
The nerves.
Not.
Anyway, thank you so much. Just to remind everyone, do get your mitts on Hamnet if you haven't. I've told you all to read it for about a year now, so if you haven't, I don't know how we're friends. But just a huge thank you to Mum as well for joining me, and to Maggie. We're going to go now, but yeah, we will see you all very, very soon. And this is why I press end broadcast and then have to double check that it really ends. We'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye.